Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video, we're going to be concentrating on the shortest of Angela Carter's short stories, The Snow Child, which forms a part of the collection The Bloody Chamber. Masterful Mr. Bertram is going to be navigating us through that in a rigorous rollercoaster ride. But before he does, I'd love for you to like this video, and why not join our tribe? Hit subscribe for all things English, literary and grammatical. Over to you, Masterful Mr. Bertram.
So, when referring to the title of this story, I want you to ask yourself, does it bear resemblance to the title of a famous fairy tale? The story derives from Snow White, written by the Grimm brothers, Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm, and was published in 1812. I think it's worth familiarizing yourself with the original story as a grounding for Carter's new story. The link to this version is at the bottom of the screen. In the traditional version, the mother wishes for Snow White to be created, whereas in Carter's version, the Count wishes for Snow White to be made from his specific sexual desires. Carter uses this to portray masculine control over the female identity, so Carter's version has been constructed to perhaps reflect her feminist readings of the fairy tale. One thing we do know, though, is that in both versions, jealousy sits at the heart of the story. In this reinterpretation, however, the Count and his wife ride through a winter landscape. The Count imagines and hopes for a child whose features are inspired by the aspects of the landscape. The Countess becomes increasingly jealous and frustrated by her husband's doting on the girl. She instructs the young woman to pick a rose, a thorn scratches the young woman, and she dies. But in a strange and morally perverse turn of events, the Count subsequently rapes her corpse and she melts away. The story ends when the Count gives his wife the rose, to which she drops it, proclaiming it bites. So let's firstly analyse the strange metamorphosis that occurs when the Count conjures up the Snow White child. He wishes for the child to have skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as a raven, which is certainly a masculine fantasy, product of his physical desires. But how, you might ask? Well, he wishes for her to be beautiful and nothing else, so it is clear that he is interested only in her appearance and her value as a sexual object. Carter is subverting the traditional fairy tale form here, as originally it is the mother who wishes for a child, but as it is the father in this story, Carter makes us question whether there is any paternal love there, or is it purely sexual? I think it's important that we analyse the individual connotations of the colour imagery that is used here. The first colour, white, represents the child's virginal purity, and in appearing stark naked, she seems all the more vulnerable and innocent. It may be that she's naked because the Count did not express anything about clothes in his wishes, or it may be because female nudity is such an obvious part of male fantasy that it didn't need to be mentioned during the wishing process, which again reiterates the reoccurring imagery of stripping clothing off the female body, which I touched upon in my video on the Earl King. The red as blood simile of the Count's wish suggests danger and foreshadows the girl's doomed fate, or it could actually symbolize the taking of her virginity, while the black of a raven's feather has an ominous quality, as it is a bird so often associated with death. So if we look at the order of these wishes, the connotations of the colours, you could argue that Carter is criticizing how men view the worth and purpose of women to be sexual objects whose virginal status is the most alluring thing about them, but once that has been taken, they are discarded. Now, from your study of Beloved, you should be familiar with the term magic realism, a narrative technique characterized by the integration of fantastical or mythical elements into a realistic chain of events. Carter uses it here through the Count's creation of the child, literally out of thin air. Perhaps this is used by Carter to reflect the Count's perception of himself as godlike due to the child's immaculate conception. He's almost marveling at his creation of this perfect sexual being. There she stood, almost acting as God in the way he has created this girl from bare materials. The trope of the silent female appears throughout this story. It is evident even from the beginning of the story, where we get the description of the Count and his wife. If we analyze the syntax here, it hints at the power dynamic between the two. The Count is introduced first, suggesting his dominance and superiority. The pronoun his presents his wife as a mere possession of his and nothing more. In fact, we are told directly of the Count's thoughts and desires via his sequence of wishes, and his is the first voice we hear in the tale. Any wishes the wife may have remain unexpressed at this point. The Countess's place is usurped by the child, as is symbolized by the transfer of the Countess's clothes onto her. The idea here is that everything a woman has, including her freedom, even the clothes that she wears, is provided and taken away by a man. She begins developing pejorative feelings of envy and frustration towards the child, plotting, how shall I be rid of her? I think this speaks to Carter's perception of women as having to compete against each other in a patriarchal society for the affection of men, to the point of each other's detriment. So who does the Countess represent symbolically? Some critics have suggested that she assumes the evil stepmother role, as she has no input into the child's creation and is envious of the child's beauty, echoing the original Snow White story by the Grimm brothers. But her cunning and manipulative nature, which is reflected in the description of her clothing here, perhaps conveys her more as a femme fatale figure, which is an archetype or stock character in literature of a female who is mysterious and seductive and has power over men, manipulating them into compromising and deadly traps. What occurs next in this story is perhaps one of the most perverse and morally corrupt acts that a man commits in Carter's Bloody Chamber stories. The Count's decision to rape the corpse of the child is somewhat baffling to the reader, but hints at Carter's perception of male sexuality as possessing a perverse nature. First of all, the word thrust conjures up the relationship between violence and sex, which is explored throughout the Bloody Chamber collection. The inclusion of the word virile to describe his member, which is a reference to his penis, of course, is noteworthy here because it could allude to the insatiable male sexual appetite, almost out of control, where the child has no defense against his sexual force. And the child's bleeding symbolically represents the beginning of her menstruation cycle. Thus she becomes a sexual being to the Count. Perhaps Carter here is criticizing the narrow and limited male conception of female sexual maturation. But by raping the child's corpse, the Count is committing an act of necrophilia and incest, as the child can symbolically be viewed as his daughter. Her death represents the cross of that liminal space between the dead and the living, but it could also represent the crossing of boundaries between what's morally acceptable and unacceptable. Nonetheless, the raping of her corpse represents male control and power and reiterates the silent female trope that I explored on the previous slide. The girl is not able to give consent because consent does not matter to those who yield power. This is reaffirmed as the girl melts after he soon finishes. This quick sexual exchange includes no eroticism, no love, and once the girl has satiated his sexual appetites, she no longer is needed, and the Count's love for her is withdrawn. She is now useless in society, as stereotypically women are objects for men to use as possession. With competition for the Count's affections now out of the way, the Countess is able to become his wife once again. To reaffirm this, he hands her the rose. It's a rather complicated symbol, the rose, a flower with thorns, beautiful but dangerous. It perhaps represents the femme fatale, that is the Countess, which I briefly touched upon earlier in this presentation. On this trail of thought, Flowers are typically represented as the female genitalia. The rose could therefore be a representation of pains and difficulty being a woman in a patriarchal world. Roses are specifically associated with love. Perhaps the rose in this story is a representation of the Count's dangerous and destructive love, as it resulted directly in the child's death. But what's puzzling is the Countess's reaction to being handed the rose. She exclaims it bites and drops it onto the floor in pain. As a final line, this adds a level of complexity to the story's conclusion. Why does she do this? Is she refusing the Count's love? Or is she lamenting the pain and anguish that she experiences being loved by the Count, and is the price that comes with a man's love, which I touched upon in my analysis of the Earl King? The first interpretation places her in a position of power as the liberated woman, whereas the latter depicts her as a victim of the patriarchy. I'll leave it up to you to decide which interpretation is correct.